Phil Spector's story does not begin with a courtroom or a headline. It begins in Los Angeles recording studios in the early 1960s, when a young producer with an oversized ego and a wounded past decided he would reshape music into something vast and overwhelming. Spector did not simply record songs. He built sound like a structure, layer upon layer of guitars, horns, strings, percussion, and echo, until it felt as if the music might burst through the speakers. He called it the wall of sound. The industry called it revolutionary, and audiences felt it like a physical force. Welcome to II True Crime. Tonight, we're digging into Phil Spector. He demanded total control. He commanded musicians like soldiers and corrected singers like a man conducting his own private army. Studio stories describe Spector pacing behind the glass, dictating every note, every mic position, every change in tempo. He did not tolerate improvisation. He wanted perfection, and he wanted credit for it. The success only reinforced his belief that he alone understood how music should sound. The more hits he produced, the more he withdrew into his own world. Colleagues described a producer who became harder to reach, harder to understand, and harder to work with. Spector grew up without stability, without security, and without the kind of gentle attention that might have softened him. His father died when he was young. Poverty and humiliation followed. He carried that trauma into adulthood like a fuse waiting for a spark. Friends and partners later described unpredictable behavior, sudden mood shifts, and an obsession with controlling the environment around him. Music was not enough to contain that hunger for dominance. Fame could not soothe the insecurity. By the 1980s, Spector had withdrawn from the musical world he once ruled. He lived in a mansion in the hills above Los Angeles, a stone fortress decorated with gold records, antiques, and displays of weapons. Visitors described the house as eerie, cold, and imposing. It was the physical embodiment of his myth and his paranoia. The house was not just a home, it was a stage. When Phil Spector entered the House of Blues on the night he met Lana Clarkson, he was not the revolutionary producer of the 1960s anymore. He was a reclusive legend with rumors clinging to him like shadows. Clarkson was working as a hostess. She had been an actress in the 1980s and early 1990s, featured in low-budget films and television appearances. Hollywood had given her opportunity, then pushed her to the margins. She carried herself with confidence, humor, and the stubborn resilience that comes from surviving disappointment. Their meeting seemed ordinary at first. Two people from different eras of fame, crossing paths in a place built for nostalgia. They talked, they drank. Spector invited her to his home. She agreed. The limousine carried them through the winding hills, past the city lights, and into the castle that had been waiting for them. What happened inside that mansion would destroy everything that came before it. The music, the legend, the myth of genius. None of it would matter after the night Lana Clarkson walked through those doors. The stage was set for the tragedy that would define both of their lives. Spector believed that the world owed him something, that the glory he had built in the 1960s should have followed him untouched into the future. But history rarely gives that kind of protection. By the time Lana Clarkson met him, the brilliance and the darkness had fused into one identity. The house was no longer the workshop of a genius. It was the place where silence pressed against the walls as heavily as the music once had. The tension around him did not exist because of celebrity alone. It came from decades of stories, quiet warnings, and whispered accounts that described the producer as someone who viewed other people as elements to be arranged, directed, or dismissed. Whether those stories were exaggerated or precise, they created an atmosphere that followed him everywhere. Even before events at the mansion changed everything, the air around Phil Spector seemed charged with potential disaster. In the entertainment world, reputations are built like legends, one story at a time, and by the night of that meeting, both Clarkson and Spector carried their own legends with them, hers of perseverance in a brutal industry, his of a genius who had retreated from the world he once dominated. The limousine doors closed, and the city outside faded away. Chapter 2. The drive to Phil Spector's home was quiet, but not peaceful. The limousine climbed through the winding hills above Los Angeles, away from the neon glare and late-night noise of Sunset Boulevard. It was after closing time at the House of Blues, and the city had begun to fold into its nocturnal version of itself. Spector lived in a massive home modeled after Pyrenees castles, a towering structure with stone walls and sharp angles. Even from the outside, it looked like a place designed by someone who wanted to keep the world at a distance. Spector asked the driver to wait, and the gates closed behind him and Lana Clarkson. Inside, Clarkson would have seen a house filled with artifacts of a career that once defined an entire era. Gold records hung like trophies. Expensive furniture lined the rooms. The atmosphere of the home reflected both success and isolation, as though the past was preserved there long after the rest of the world had moved on. Accounts from guests and acquaintances described weapons displayed openly throughout the home, as though the guns were objects of interest rather than tools for safety. A revolver on a counter, a shotgun leaning against a wall. For visitors who later described their experiences, the house felt less like a residence and more like a stage set for someone who viewed attention and control as necessities. Clarkson had her own history by this point in life. She had been an actress with a distinctive presence, tall, confident, and charismatic. She appeared in B-movies, action roles, and television parts. Hollywood can be a harsh place for people who are no longer new. Clarkson had taken work as a hostess at the House of Blues to stay connected to the world she knew well. Friends described her as determined, kind, and resilient. She was not a stereotype, not someone drifting aimlessly. Her life was still unfolding. She was still navigating the unpredictable landscape of celebrity and opportunity. Whatever conversation unfolded in the early moments inside Spector's house, the public would never hear its exact words. What is known comes only from later testimony and evidence. There was alcohol. There were two people who had met only hours earlier. The driver waited outside. The house grew quiet. Somewhere in the mansion, the dynamic between two strangers shifted. According to the prosecution, the night turned tragic when Clarkson ended up seated in a chair near the foyer. The details that emerged later became the core of the case. Clarkson was found with a gunshot wound to her mouth. The weapon was discovered near her body. Spector came downstairs holding the gun. The driver reported hearing him say, "I'll think I may have killed somebody." The police arrived to a scene that was still and eerily composed. Clarkson did not show signs of a struggle. The house did not show evidence of a violent fight. The scene appeared calm, almost staged by the silence itself. Spector would later insist that Clarkson's death was an accident or a suicide. Those were his statements. His attorneys would repeat them in court. The prosecutors argued a different version, that Spector shot Clarkson during an argument or moment of anger. Forensic analysis examined blood patterns, the angle of the gun, and gunshot residue. Those details became the focus of experts, attorneys, and eventually the jury. But at the center of it all was the house itself, a place where the symbols of Spector's past success had become the backdrop for one of Hollywood's most notorious tragedies. After that night, the mansion would never again be remembered as the home of a famous producer. It would be remembered as the location where a woman died and where a legend collided with consequences. Neighbors and friends watched the police lights flash across the walls as Spector was taken into custody. Reporters learned of the incident within hours. The story began spreading before dawn. And in the history of true crime, Hollywood, and music, that night became the moment everything changed. Chapter 3. In the hours after Lana Clarkson's death, investigators treated the mansion as both a crime scene and a puzzle. The foyer was quiet, except for the movement of police and forensic teams. Clarkson sat slumped in an antique chair, her body angled in a way that suggested she had been seated when the gun fired. The first responders noticed what was missing as much as what was present. There were no overturned tables, no damaged decorations, no shattered glass. The surroundings appeared undisturbed. It was the kind of scene that forces detectives to focus on small details rather than chaos. The gun, a Colt .38 Special, lay close to Clarkson. Bloodstains and spatter were examined. These physical details became central to the prosecution later. Clarkson did not have gunshot residue on her hands. The trajectory of the bullet suggested it had been fired from close range by someone facing her. Forensic experts studied the pattern of blood on Spector's jacket. The prosecution argued that these elements indicated he fired the weapon. Spector maintained she had taken her own life. Those competing narratives would become the heart of the trial. One of the most significant early voices in the case was Spector's driver, Adriano de Souza. He told investigators that Spector emerged from the house holding the gun and said, "I think I may have killed somebody." The defense questioned his memory and interpretation, but the statement echoed through every stage of the legal process. It was one of the few clear pieces of dialogue recorded from that night. Police found more than just evidence related to the shooting. They found the environment itself, a mansion filled with memorabilia, antiques, and displays of firearms. Prior guests would later describe nights in the house where Spector appeared unpredictable or stern. These stories did not prove guilt, but they colored the atmosphere surrounding the investigation. Detectives had to separate rumor from fact and personality from evidence. The autopsy confirmed the cause of death as a gunshot to the mouth. The angle and force of the bullet were documented. The medical report became one of the most clinically precise parts of the entire case. It lacked speculation and emotion. It simply described what happened physically. Prosecutors believed the autopsy aligned with their theory. The defense argued that the report did not eliminate the possibility of suicide. The scientific details did not close the case. They opened it wider. Meanwhile, the media began circling. Los Angeles is a city that transforms events into stories almost instantly. Reporters arrived at the mansion before sunrise. Helicopters filmed from above. Commentators mentioned Spector's legendary musical career in the same breath as the crime. Clarkson's name was repeated again and again. Every headline paired the two. Fame ensured that the case would not remain local or quiet. It became national news. Detectives began interviewing people from Spector's past. They looked into his personal history. They reviewed his reputation. They collected accounts of unpredictable behavior and threats with weapons. None of those stories were part of a conviction. They were pieces of context. The investigators had to determine which details mattered and which were distractions. Every homicide investigation is a combination of physical evidence and human testimony. In this case, both sides seemed weighted. The gun was real. The blood was real. The dead woman was real. But the night contained too many unanswered questions. What did they discuss? Did they argue? Did something trigger a sudden shift? No one except Spector and Clarkson had been inside when the gunshot sounded. Clarkson could not speak for herself. Spector insisted on his innocence. By the time detectives finished processing the scene, the facts and uncertainties had fused into one story. A woman had died inside a mansion built to celebrate a man's power and legacy. The investigation had only begun, but the shape of the case was already forming. The night was no longer a private tragedy. It was the first chapter in a legal battle, a cultural event, and a mystery that demanded answers the evidence alone could not give. Chapter 4. The arrest of Phil Spector marked the moment when a private tragedy became a public reckoning. He was taken into custody and released on bail, but the story had already spread far beyond Los Angeles. The media framed it instantly as the downfall of a genius, the murder of an actress, and the collision of two very different lives. News outlets replayed his musical accomplishments, while the images of police cars and crime scene tape filled television screens. The wall of sound now had a new association: violence, death, and suspicion. Even before the trial began, both sides built their narratives. The prosecutors focused on the physical evidence and the driver's statement. The defense argued that Clarkson had taken her own life and that Spector had been caught in the aftermath. Those two arguments would define the legal battle for years. Meanwhile, the world tried to make sense of the contrast between the Spector who built classics for the Ronettes and the Beatles, and the Spector who stood accused of killing a woman in his home. Investigators continued interviewing people from Spector's past. Friends, partners, and acquaintances came forward with stories of threats and weapons. Some described incidents where Spector had been controlling or volatile. Others defended him and painted him as eccentric rather than dangerous. None of this ensured guilt or innocence, but it created an atmosphere that made the case impossible to view without considering the man's history. Clarkson's life received a different kind of attention. Her friends spoke of her talent, her humor, and her persistence. She was not just a tragic figure. She was a person whose life had continued even when fame did not. The first trial began in 2007, 4 years after Clarkson's death. It was a spectacle. The courtroom became the setting for a story that pulled in forensic experts, psychologists, investigators, and witnesses who described Spector's home as intimidating. The trial stretched on for months. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, gun analysis, crime scene reconstruction, and testimony from 5 women who alleged that Spector had threatened them with guns in the past. The defense countered with its own experts and questioned every witness. They argued that Clarkson had been depressed and that the shooting was self-inflicted. The jury struggled. After months of testimony, they were unable to reach a unanimous decision. A mistrial was declared. The public reaction was immediate. The mistrial only deepened the mystery. The story did not end there. A second trial was scheduled. Evidence was reviewed again. New angles were examined. The world waited. During the first trial, Spector presented himself in elaborate outfits and dramatic hairstyles. His appearance became a topic of discussion as much as the case itself. Some saw it as theatrical. Others saw it as a distraction. The second trial began in 2008 with a more restrained tone. The courtroom was quieter, and the witnesses were familiar. The same arguments returned, but this time the focus grew sharper. The evidence had not changed, but the interpretation of it had. As the second trial moved forward, Clarkson's family attended the hearings. They listened to every detail. They listened to the experts debate the angle of a bullet and the meaning of blood patterns. They listened to attorneys describe her final moments. The case had become a story about responsibility and consequence. The courtroom was filled with the weight of those questions. By the time the closing arguments arrived in the second trial, the case had drifted beyond legal analysis. It had become a reflection of Spector's legacy. The jury listened again to the prosecution and the defense. They considered the driver's testimony, the forensic reports, and the autopsy. They reviewed the evidence and the questions it could not fully answer. Then, after years of uncertainty, they reached their decision. Chapter 5. The verdict came down in April 2009, and this time there was no mistrial, no split decision, no unresolved debate waiting for a future hearing. A Los Angeles jury found Phil Spector guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Lana Clarkson. The courtroom went very still as the clerk read the words. Years of investigation, 2 full trials, and countless arguments about science, intent, and history had narrowed into a simple legal conclusion. For Clarkson's family, it was not closure in any complete sense, but it was an answer. For Spector, it was the moment his public myth and his private actions finally collided in a way he could not control. Reporters rushed from the courthouse to file stories. Outside, cameras captured every glimpse of movement. The defense team, the prosecutors, Clarkson's mother and friends. The case had stretched across 6 years, becoming part of the background noise of American culture. Now it snapped into focus. The same man who had once shaped some of the most romantic and dramatic records in pop music faced a future defined not by studios and stages, but by cells and schedules. The headline wrote itself, legendary producer convicted of murder. The tone of the coverage shifted overnight. Articles that once tried to balance genius and suspicion now led with the crime. A few weeks later, Spector returned to court for sentencing. The judge imposed a sentence of 19 years to life. In explaining the punishment, the court acknowledged both the gravity of taking a life and the long pattern of threats and gun use presented at trial through witness testimony. The defense repeated its central claim one more time, that Clarkson's death had been a tragic self-inflicted act, that Spector had been blamed for something he did not intend or did not do. The prosecution stood by its narrative of responsibility. The sentence made clear which story the system accepted. From that point on, Spector's world shrank dramatically. The sprawling mansion in Alhambra, with its trophies, antiques, and casual gun displays, was replaced by the routines of state prison. He had once designed his life around absolute control, controlling sound, controlling rooms, controlling people. Prison offered none of that. He became an inmate, subject to rules he could not rewrite. Reports over the years described his declining health and increasingly solitary existence. Whatever version of events he believed privately, the legal version was fixed. Outside the walls, his legacy was being rewritten in real time. The records remained. The wall of sound still echoed through playlists, films, and retrospective box sets. But critics and listeners now had to decide how to hold that work alongside the fact of his conviction. Some tried to separate the music from the man, arguing that the songs belonged to the singers and to history as much as to Spector. Others insisted that knowing what happened to Clarkson changed the way those lush productions felt, that the sense of overwhelming control baked into the arrangements now carried a darker resonance. For Lana Clarkson's friends and family, the years after the verdict were about keeping her visible as more than a tragic figure. Interviews, memorials, and documentaries highlighted her humor, her kindness, and the energy she brought to the people around her. She had been a working actress, a hostess, a friend, a daughter. She had dreams and disappointments, like anyone living in the orbit of Hollywood. Her name would forever appear in the same sentence as Spector's. But those closest to her worked to make sure she was remembered as a complete person, and not only as the victim in a famous case. In the end, the Spector trial became more than an examination of one night in a mansion. It became a story about what happens when power is left unchallenged, when patterns of intimidation are ignored until it is too late, and when genius is treated as a shield instead of a responsibility. Phil Spector once created sound that made listeners feel invincible, as if emotion itself had been turned into architecture. Yet the echo that lasts the longest is not the fade-out of a hit single. It is the sound of a jury saying guilty, and the silence that followed in a room where even the most powerful man could not talk his way past the weight of a single bullet. Chapter 6. Phil Spector's years in prison did not silence the arguments about his legacy. If anything, the debates grew louder. He had become a symbol of artistic genius fused with violence, a figure who forced people to ask whether great art could ever be separated from the actions of the person who created it. Documentaries, podcasts, and true crime shows returned again and again to the same questions. Was Spector a visionary undone by hubris, or a dangerous personality who had hidden behind his fame? Musicians who had worked with him defended the music, pointing to the songs that had shaped generations. Others insisted that the brilliance and the brutality were inseparable, that the power heard in his recordings mirrored the controlling personality described in accounts by women who felt intimidated by him. Prison revealed a quieter and more diminished version of Spector. Reports over the years described a man who suffered from declining health and spent long stretches in medical wards rather than the general population. His world of lavish studios, session players, and celebrity visitors was replaced by the routines of state facility life. He reportedly struggled with depression and isolation. The man who once designed his entire environment around control now had almost none. He became a distant figure. Not only physically but culturally. His voice was no longer present in the discussions happening outside his cell. He became an idea as much as a person. Meanwhile, the narrative around Lana Clarkson evolved. Her family and friends worked hard to ensure she remained present in the story as a full and complex human being. Tributes highlighted her acting work, her sense of humor, and her ability to support others even when her own career faced setbacks. Clarkson represented something profoundly recognizable about Hollywood, the resilience required to stay afloat in a system that discards people easily. Her death became a cautionary tale not just about violence, but about the vulnerability that can accompany fame and ambition. When Phil Spector died in January 2021 at the age of 81, the public reaction reflected the contradiction of his legacy. News outlets published obituaries that paired his musical achievements with the reality of the murder conviction. Some headlines focused on his innovations, describing him as a revolutionary producer whose wall of sound reshaped recording. Others foregrounded the crime. The coverage made clear that his story could not be told in a single tone. The brilliance and the tragedy were inseparable in death. Spector did not receive the kind of universal celebration that often accompanies the passing of cultural figures. Instead, his legacy splintered into conversations about accountability, power, and the myth of the tortured genius. The music survived, the influence remained, but the story that defined his later life had become permanent. Clarkson's name was now part of the history of American music, not because of her association with Spector, but because the world refused to forget her. The wall of sound endures, but so does the silence of that night in his mansion. The echoes of his recordings remain powerful, yet they now carry the weight of a loss that cannot be undone. Spector once believed his music would outlast everything else. He was right, but the most enduring part of his legacy is not just the sound he created. It is the reminder that genius does not excuse violence, that control can become destruction, and that a single moment can define the future of everyone involved. Chapter 7. The legacy of Phil Spector exists in a strange and conflicted place. It is not simply the legacy of a murderer or the legacy of a master producer. Instead, it is the legacy of a man whose life forced the world to confront uncomfortable truths about art and power. Even after the verdict, cultural critics, fans, and historians continued to argue over how he should be remembered. Some insisted that his innovations outweighed his crimes and that his productions were landmarks of American pop music. Others believed the crime overshadowed everything else, that the murder of Lana Clarkson was the one part of his story that could never be separated from the rest. The argument never reached a single conclusion because the story was too complicated to be reduced to a single sentence. After the trial, the wall of sound took on a different tone. A lush orchestration and sweeping musical arrangements began to feel like symbols of control rather than romance. People who had once praised the production now heard something darker in it. The music had always been overwhelming, but after Clarkson's death, it began to sound like a warning. The tapestries of sound that once felt triumphant now carried a shadow. Critics pointed to the dominating presence of Spector's style and saw the reflection of the same personality described in accounts from women who felt intimidated or threatened by him. The music never changed. The world around it did. The echoes of those arrangements became metaphors for the man himself, powerful, grand, and unable to recognize any voice but his own. In the years that followed, Lana Clarkson's story continued to expand in the public imagination. Her friends and family refused to allow her name to fade into obscurity. Her life became a symbol of resilience in an unforgiving industry. Documentaries and articles celebrated her ambition, her kindness, and her ability to stand tall, even when Hollywood gave her little in return. The story of the trial reminded everyone that fame is not protection. It can be a cage, a spotlight, or a weapon. Clarkson's death was not the end of her presence in the world. It was the beginning of a new chapter where she was finally recognized as a fully realized individual. These discussions bled into wider conversations about celebrity, abuse, and accountability. The entertainment industry had long protected powerful men simply because they were brilliant or profitable. Spector's case became a turning point. People began to question why society excuses violence when it comes packaged in genius. Why do audiences cling to the work of someone who caused so much damage? Why does the myth of talent outweigh the stories of the people hurt along the way? Clarkson's case forced the world to confront those questions. The trial did not end the debate, but it ignited a cultural shift. Pop culture reflected this shift in real time. Retrospectives and biographies no longer separated art from the artist. Instead, they examined both as parts of the same story. Hollywood began to reconsider the way it spoke about genius and the way it allowed bad behavior to flourish. Podcasts, films, and books began to spotlight victims instead of glorifying the perpetrators. Clarkson's name was spoken more often, not less. She became the center of the narrative rather than a historical detail buried in footnotes. Courses on music history, media ethics, and true crime used her case as an example of how legacies are shaped and reshaped by collective memory. Fans were forced to choose how they would interact with Spector's legacy. Some refused to listen to the music again. Others insisted the songs belonged to history now. The debate crossed generations and platforms. It entered classrooms, online communities, and conversations about ethics and memory. The wall of sound still holds power, but so does the silence left behind. The echoes of Spector's work are permanent, so is the tragedy. Lana Clarkson's legacy became a counterweight, proof that remembrance is an act of value, not just fate. In the end, Phil Spector's legacy does not belong to him alone. It belongs to everyone who listens to his music and everyone who remembers Lana Clarkson. It belongs to the culture that allowed him to rise and the justice system that finally brought him down. The story became larger than either of them. It became a reminder that even the most celebrated artist cannot escape accountability, and that one moment can define how history will remember a life. It is the final truth of the case. Talent may echo, but consequence echoes longer. Chapter 8. For all the arguments, analysis, and cultural debates that followed the case, one truth remained at the center of the story. The crime at Phil Spector's mansion was not an abstract idea, nor a symbol to be assigned meaning by critics. It was a real moment that ended a real life. Lana Clarkson was not a metaphor. She was a woman who had dreams and frustrations, who works to build a career in a city that promises everything and delivers nothing without cost. Her final night was not part of a narrative built for the public. It was a moment of trust, vulnerability, and terrible consequence. That is why the story remained unforgettable. It was not merely tragedy. It was a reminder that the world rarely protects the people who deserve protection the most. In the years after the murder, Clarkson's friends and family became the guardians of her memory. They reminded the world that she was more than a headline. She was a performer who took every opportunity she could find. She was a daughter who stayed connected to the people who raised her. She was someone who held on to her dignity even when the roles were smaller than the talent she brought to them. Hollywood is filled with stories of near successes and almost breakthroughs. Clarkson's story could have been one of those, but the murder turned it into something else entirely. It showed the fragility of fame, the danger of power, and the reality that the entertainment industry does not always see the humanity of the people within it. Spector's fate forced the entertainment industry to confront how it had enabled him. The success, the power, the influence, and the mythology had shielded him for decades. Accounts of controlling behavior and intimidation were whispered, laughed off, or ignored. People claimed that genius is often eccentric, that great men are simply difficult. This excuse became a shield he could hide behind. When the verdict came down, that shield finally broke. The justice system had not been swayed by his legend. It had not been persuaded by the mythology of brilliance. The verdict announced that even geniuses are accountable when they cross the line into violence. The story of Phil Spector did not end with his prison sentence or his death. It continued in every discussion about separating art from the artist. It continued in every debate about power and accountability. His music changed the sound of the 20th century. His crime forced a reckoning that shaped the 21st. His legacy became the bridge between those two eras. Some listeners still hear the records with the same awe they always felt. Others hear reminders of what happens when someone is allowed to wield talent as a shield against consequence. Clarkson's memory also changed the way true crime stories are told. She became a reminder that victims are not props in a narrative about someone else's downfall. They are the heart of the story. Her life inspired conversations about justice, violence against women, and the responsibility of institutions to protect people from abuse. Her story helped redefine the direction of true crime toward honoring the victim instead of glorifying the killer. She did not disappear into the background of history. She became a symbol of the shift in storytelling itself. The tragedy at the mansion became more than a sensational headline. It became a lesson about the limits of power and the inevitability of consequence. Phil Spector wanted to build sound that would tower over everything. He wanted his music to fill rooms and overwhelm doubt. He succeeded, but the final echo of his story was not the sound of a record. It was the recognition that no creation, no genius, no myth is strong enough to erase the truth. Lana Clarkson's life was the truth at the center of the story. In the end, the question of legacy did not fall on Spector alone. It fell on everyone who listened, everyone who wrote about the case, everyone who examined it with awe, horror, or confusion. His legacy became a mirror for the culture that shaped him. Clarkson's legacy became a reminder of the cost of ignoring warning signs. The case forced the world to confront its values and to decide what it chooses to remember. The music remains, but so does the memory of the woman who never allowed herself to be defined by tragedy. The story of Phil Spector became an echo that did not fade. It was retold in documentaries, in essays, in news specials, in the memories of those who knew Clarkson, and in the lessons that shaped future conversations about justice. In every version, the tragedy remained the core. There was no way to soften the truth. A brilliant producer created art that changed everything, and a woman lost her life inside the house that became his fortress. The world chose to remember both. It chose to carry their names forward. acknowledge the darkness and the brilliance. It chose to confront the truth and demand better.